Welcome to the Ask Junior Daily Judgment Podcast. I'm Priya Sharma, and joining me today is Arjun Gupta.
Hello, everyone. We're excited to dive into today's important judgments. But before we begin, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share our podcast if you enjoy our daily legal breakdowns.
That's right, your support helps us reach more listeners and continue providing in-depth analysis of the latest court decisions. Now let's get started with today's case. Anjum, Kadari and Anar versus Union of India and Ors, a decision from the Supreme Court of India.
This case involves the constitutionality of the Uttar Pradesh Board of Madarsa Education Act 2004, also known as the Madarsa Act. It's a complex issue with far-reaching implications for the education of minority communities in India.
Absolutely, Arjun. Before we get into the specifics, let's lay out the basic facts. This case arose because the Allahabad High Court declared the Madarsa Act unconstitutional, arguing it violated principles of secularism and fundamental rights.
Priya, that's a good starting point. So the Supreme Court was essentially tasked with reviewing that decision. The Madarsa Act aims to regulate the standards of education in madrasas, which are Islamic religious schools, throughout Uttar Pradesh.
To give our listeners a better understanding of the context, madrasas have a long history in India, going back to the Tughlaq period. They've traditionally served as centers for both basic education and advanced learning.
That's right. Today, there are approximately 13,000 madrasas in Uttar Pradesh alone, educating over 12 lakh students. The state government even provides significant funding for these institutions.
So the High Court's decision to strike down the Madarsa Act had a significant impact on the education system in Uttar Pradesh. It ordered the integration of madrasa students into regular schools, which created a lot of controversy.
Exactly. This led to several appeals before the Supreme Court, which ultimately had to grapple with a series of complex legal questions.
Let's break down those legal questions, Arjun. The court had to determine 1. Did the Madarsa Act violate the principle of secularism, which is considered a fundamental aspect of the Indian Constitution? 2. Did the Act violate fundamental rights guaranteed under Part 3 of the Constitution, particularly Articles 14, right to equality, 21A, right to education, and others? 3. Was the Act within the legislative competence of the state legislature under Entry 25 of List 3 of the 7th Schedule, which deals with education? 4. Is there a conflict between Article 21A, right to education, and Article 30, rights of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions in the context of madrasa education? 5. Do the provisions of the Madarsa Act concerning higher education degrees conflict with the UGC Act, which is enacted under Entry 66 of List 1 and governs higher education?
It's a lot to unpack, Priya. The court was essentially asked to balance the state's interest in regulating education with the constitutional rights of minorities to establish and administer their own educational institutions.
You're right, Arjun. Let's go through the court's reasoning and its final decision. The Supreme Court addressed each of these questions in detail, relying on previous judgments and constitutional principles.
The court first tackled the issue of secularism. They emphasized that secularism, as a core principle of the Indian Constitution, must be understood in the context of express constitutional provisions, not just as an abstract idea.
That's interesting. Could you elaborate on that, Arjun?
Sure. The court pointed to Articles 25-30 of the Constitution, which address religious freedom and the rights of minorities. They reasoned that secularism allows the state to regulate secular activities associated with religious practices while protecting genuine religious practices. They found that the Madarsa Act was designed to improve educational standards rather than promote religious instruction, making it consistent with constitutional secularism.
So in essence, the court acknowledged that madrasas provide religious education, but saw the Madarsa Act as a tool to ensure that those institutions also provide quality education that prepares students for society and higher education.
Precisely. The court also addressed concerns about the violation of fundamental rights. Here, they applied the principle of substantive equality rather than formal equality.
Could you explain that distinction, Arjun?
Of course. Formal equality simply treats everyone the same. Substantive equality, on the other hand, recognizes that different groups have different starting points and needs. It aims to create a level playing field by addressing those disparities.
So, the court felt that by ensuring quality education in madrasas, the Madarsa Act actually promotes substantive equality by giving minority communities a better chance to participate in society.
Exactly. The court found that regulating educational standards in madrasas actually helps students achieve competency for participating in society and pursuing higher education. It doesn't infringe on fundamental rights, but rather enables their meaningful exercise by the minority community.
That's an interesting perspective, Arjun. Let's move on to the court's reasoning on legislative competence.
Here, the court looked at Entry 25 of List 3, which covers education, and rejected a narrow interpretation that would exclude institutions providing some religious instruction. They reasoned that just because madrasas include religious teachings doesn't mean that the state can't regulate their educational aspects.
So the court found that regulating educational standards in madrasas falls within the state's legislative competence. It's an important point as it emphasizes the state's responsibility to ensure quality education for all citizens, regardless of their religious background.
Exactly. The court also recognized that Article 30 specifically protects the rights of minorities to establish and administer educational institutions. They emphasized that reading Entry 25 to exclude madrasas would contradict the constitutional scheme.
That's right. Now, let's address the interplay between Article 21A, right to education, and Article 30, minority rights. This is a crucial aspect of the case, as it relates to the question of whether the right to education can override minority rights.
The court looked at the RTE Act, which is a law that seeks to guarantee free and compulsory education for all children between the ages of 6 and 14. It's important to note that the RTE Act specifically exempts madrasas.
That exemption raises questions about the balance between the right to education and minority rights, right?
Absolutely. The court found that Article 21A cannot be interpreted to completely eliminate minority rights under Article 30. They emphasized that the state must find a balance between ensuring educational standards and preserving minority institutions' ability to establish and administer their own educational institutions. The court found that the Madarsa Act achieved that balance through reasonable regulation.
So, the court essentially said that while the state has a responsibility to ensure access to quality education for all, it also needs to respect the rights of minorities to establish and administer their own educational institutions.
Exactly. Finally, let's discuss the conflict between the Madarsa Act and the UGC Act regarding higher education degrees. The court found that some provisions of the Madarsa Act regulating Fazil and Kamil degrees, which are higher education degrees awarded by madrasas, conflict with the UGC Act's exclusive jurisdiction over higher education standards.
That's a significant finding, Arjun. Could you explain what the implications are?
The court declared those specific provisions of the Madarsa Act unconstitutional because they encroached on the UGC's authority. However, they found these provisions severable, meaning they could be removed from the Madarsa Act without affecting the Act's core purpose of regulating school education. Therefore, the remaining provisions of the Madarsa Act remain valid and enforceable.
So the court essentially upheld the Madarsa Act as constitutional, but removed the sections dealing with higher education degrees.
You got it, Priya. This means that the state can continue regulating educational standards in madrasas, but cannot control the awarding of higher education degrees. That authority remains with the UGC.
That's a clear distinction, Arjun. So what are the key takeaways from this judgment?
This judgment affirms the constitutional validity of the Madarsa Act, but it also underscores the importance of respecting minority rights and maintaining a balance between the state's interest in regulating education and protecting the freedom of minority institutions to administer their own educational programs.
It's a complex issue, Arjun, and this judgment provides valuable insight into the legal framework surrounding the education of minority communities in India. It also emphasizes the state's obligation to ensure that all students have access to quality education.
Absolutely, Priya. This case has far-reaching implications for how the state approaches the education of minority communities. It's a reminder of the delicate balance that must be struck between the right to education and the right of minorities to preserve their own cultures and traditions. Nar.
Before we wrap up, Arjun, let's try to illustrate some of these concepts with a simple analogy. Imagine a school that offers both regular subjects and religious studies. The state can regulate the curriculum for the regular subjects to ensure that students are prepared for society. However, the school can still offer religious studies, as long as those studies don't conflict with the state's educational goals.
That's a great example, Priya. It highlights the distinction between the state's responsibility to provide quality education and its duty to respect minority rights.
And that wraps up our analysis of today's judgment. We hope you found our discussion informative and engaging.
Before we sign off, we'd like to remind our listeners once again to like, subscribe, and share our podcast. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue bringing you daily updates on the most important legal decisions.
Absolutely. And don't forget to tune in tomorrow for another exciting episode. Until then, this is Priya Sharma
And Arjun Gupta. Signing off. Thanks for listening to the Ask Junior Daily Judgment podcast.